Okay, this is chapter 7 of The Night Singer. 7. The German couple who had discovered the dead body were staying at an inn in Vickelby. The inn was painted yellow, but it was hidden behind so much greenery that Eric almost drove straight past it. He turned off and pulled up by the front door. In the rearview mirror, he saw that Adam and Kirsten Butchner were holding hands, or rather, Kirsten was clinging to her husband. Eric climbed out and looked around. Between the trees, he could make out a seating area in the large garden. It was just past 11, but there was almost no one else around. "Maybe you should sit down over there," he suggested, nodding towards the seats. Eric had studied German at school, but he was far more comfortable speaking English. It was the language he and Supriya used most often at home. Fortunately, the German's English was good. Eric had asked a few questions about their lives and their family during the drive over, trying to put them at ease, and had learned that one of their children lived in Canada, another in Australia. It was obvious the Butchners were still shaken by what had happened, and Eric was glad he had been able to give them a ride back to the inn. Since Hannah was in Farsten, he had plenty of time, and it would likely be easier to take their statements here than at the crime scene. The seating area in the garden was incredibly quiet, and as they stepped between the trees, it was like the rest of the world had disappeared. All they could hear was the wind in the leaves and the occasional bird chirping. Eric wondered what the rest area at Mockelmosen was usually like, whether the mist was common there. The silence there had felt different, full of undertones. They sat down at a rickety white wooden table, and Eric asked whether he could get them something to drink. Neither wanted anything, so he took out his notepad. "Could you tell me how you found the body?" he asked. "I saw him first," said Adam. "I'd climbed over the ladder, the thing keeping the livestock in, and when I got to the other side, I turned around to help Kirsten." Adam paused and glanced at his wife. "I tried to stop her from looking over there, but I couldn't speak." "It was so awful," said Kirsten. "That poor boy." Eric nodded. Investigations involving the death of young people were always the worst. His own daughter would be starting school this autumn. "And you didn't see anything before that while you were climbing over the ladder?" he asked. "No," said Adam. "The wall the boy was leaning against was in the way. We were looking straight ahead. It was so beautiful out there in the Alvar." Eric murmured in agreement. It was beautiful, but there was also a bleakness to the place that he hadn't been expecting. "Did you notice anything in the rest area?" he asked. "No," the Butchners replied in unison. Kirsten fell silent again, but Adam continued. "It was so peaceful," he said. "All we could hear were the birds." "Were there any other cars there?" "One, I think. That car had still been there when the officers arrived at the scene. It was my 65th birthday a few weeks ago," Kirsten explained, "and I wanted to celebrate my retirement by coming to Oland. My grandmother was from here." She had already told Eric the same story in the car, and she smiled, embarrassed, when she realized she had repeated herself. Eric wondered whether it was simply the shock that was confusing her. Adam placed a hand on his wife's knee. "I've been retired for 2 years," he said. "It's been pretty boring doing everything alone." "Did you pass anyone else on the way to the rest area?" Eric asked, trying to steer the conversation back to the dead boy. "There was a man on his bike," said Kirsten. "How far from Mockelmosen?" Kirsten gave her husband an uncertain glance. "A few 100 meters," said Adam. "What did he look like?" "Blonde, with a thin blue jacket. Around 30, maybe." "And which way was he cycling?" "Toward us. His face seemed harried, somehow. That's why I remember him." "Do you remember what color the bike was?" "I think it was red." A middle-aged woman came out of the guest house and began walking toward them. Her thick, gray, flecked hair was plaited, and she was wearing a patterned apron. "Are you back already?" she asked cheerily. The Butchners exchanged an uncomfortable look, and Eric chose to pull out his ID and briefly explain what was happening, that they had found a dead body out in the middle of the Alvar. The woman raised a hand to her mouth. A murder just as summer was approaching was hardly what the tourist industry wanted. But then she turned back to the Germans and asked whether they needed anything. A cup of tea, perhaps. Maybe later," said Kirsten. "I don't think I can manage anything right now." The woman left them in peace, and Kirsten placed her palm on her husband's chest. "I'm so tired," she said. "I'd like to go and lie down for a while." "We're almost done here," said Eric. "How long will you be staying?" "We got here on Sunday, and the plan was to stay another week," said Adam. "But now—" "I'd appreciate it if you didn't leave for a few days," Eric told them. Not just for the sake of the investigation, but for their own. He thought they would find it easier to process what had happened if they didn't immediately hurry home. He gave them his card and told them to call him if they thought of anything else. You might get a few calls from journalists, Eric continued, or they might come out here looking for you. I'd advise you not to talk to them if they do. That was also for both their sake and the investigations. When people were in shock, they sometimes said things they later came to regret. The news that a boy had been found dead in the middle of the Alvar had likely already leaked, but the Butchners knew details that needed to be kept from the press if they wanted to avoid making the job more difficult for the police.